All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, November 2nd of 2021. Thanks for tuning into the stream today, whether you're watching me live here or watching this back as a recording. Appreciate you being here today. If this is your first time watching our stream, I know we get new viewers here every day, which I always say is just awesome. Love to see it that we are continuing to grow our little YouTube community here. This is a live open Q&A style show where I answer questions from you guys about SaberSim, about DFS strategy, whatever you guys want to talk about. We get questions in through support, our support email, support@sabersim.com. Great way to get your questions in. Just email us. Let us know you want them to be answered on stream. We'll do that. We also get a bunch of questions in through Slack, our office hours channel in Slack. If you are not already in our Slack community, there is a link to join in the description of every past office hours video. So you can join, get into the office hours channel, get into our other channels, see our sim alerts. Awesome place to be. And of course, YouTube chat. We always get a bunch of questions in through YouTube chat live here on the show, but also some of these ahead of time. I've got one in there sitting in my queue here from this morning. So as I'm talking through stuff here, feel free to pop your questions into chat. I love when I get live engagement from you guys. We do this show live for a reason. I don't just record this video and put it out after the fact. Do it live for a reason because I want you guys to have a chance to ask follow-up questions and clarifying questions, and also just give your 2 cents. If you've got an opinion, we've got an awesome comment here basically today that I want to talk about from Shady Advice, who watched yesterday's stream and made a really strong point about something related to excluding or including players in the post-build versus the pre-build part of the process that I hadn't thought about at all. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit today, but really just a really sharp observation. So that kind of stuff's awesome. That stuff helps me out. So definitely feel free to shout out your ideas as I'm here on stream. That's the whole point of doing it live. We did get a really good question in the other day on a actual comment. So not the live chat, but a comment on the YouTube video. And I think it was from a Kevin. Really good question. So I'm going to talk about that here today as well. We don't get a ton of YouTube comments. It is definitely a fine place to leave your thoughts and questions if you do end up watching this show after it's not live anymore, after it's a recording, or any of our strategy sessions. So I've been keeping an eye on those comments, trying to reply to people as there's questions coming in there. So if you watch this as a recording, feel free to start putting your questions down there as well. The comments are great for us, and we'll answer that one question we got in through the YouTube comments here. But anyway, with all of that said, we'll go ahead and start jumping into some questions here. Just a bit more housekeeping real quick. I published a video today. It just came out today. It's called Building High Upside NFL DFS Lineups with SaberSim. It's down here on our YouTube channel under the strategy sessions. If you subscribe to us, you probably got an alert about it. It looks like we've already had a few people watch it. I mentioned this video was coming last week. This video is literally me doing my entire NFL DFS process live on Sunday morning for the Week 8 slate. So I recorded it, talked through everything I was doing, my actual process. If you've seen a lot of our other NFL content, I think it's a really good video to see how I kind of put all the pieces together and what I actually do. I mentioned in that video, it's not the only way to do it. It's not necessarily the only right way to do it. But if you're interested in seeing what actually my NFL process looks like on every Sunday, interesting video to watch there. It's a follow-up for the same kind of video we did during baseball season. So the only thing about that is I unfortunately recorded that whole video before the Jamal Williams and Calvin Ridley news came out. So that news broke like the second I stopped the stream or stopped the video. So everything you're seeing in there is before that Ridley and Jamal Williams news came out, which kind of changed the whole slate, but still a good video. Tomorrow, I'm going to be publishing a video that is going to break down contest selection strategies in NBA. So we did a contest selection video for NFL. It's also here in the strategy sessions. It is called How to Double Your NFL DFS ROI in 15 minutes. Not a clickbait title, legitimately something you can do with proper contest selection. I follow up to this video for NBA instead. So literally I am breaking down, going through the DraftKings and FanDuel lobby contest by contest and basically saying in order, this is the first contest I would play. This is the next best contest. As your bankroll gets bigger and bigger, I would play then this contest, then this contest, then this contest. This is when I would start to work in cash. This is when I would start to, if you're playing on DraftKings, start to include FanDuel, all of that. So that video will come out tomorrow. Super excited about that as well. And then on Thursday, we'll be doing a strategy session. We've got a couple members members of the SaberSim community, which I'm super excited about, going to be coming on. Some of the guys that are much better NHL DFS players than I am, coming on to talk NHL DFS strategy, share their thoughts on how to play NHL DFS optimally, how to find upside, how to use SaberSim to build good NHL lineups. So super excited about that. That will be live. That will be our strategy session for this week. It'll be in this time slot, 2 p.m. Eastern on Thursday. So definitely looking forward to that. A lot of awesome content coming out this week. So stay tuned for all of that. But that's all I had in terms of announcements and housekeeping and things like that. We'll go ahead and start to roll into some of these questions. But before I jump into that, curious, today's show, let me know if you are a light theme fan or if you are a light mode fan or a dark mode fan on SaberSim. I've been using dark mode on all of these streams because I kind of thought that's what everybody likes the most here. But I actually prefer the light mode, especially when it's during the daytime. And I've been hearing from a few users and a couple members of the SaberSim community that maybe the light theme is actually a bit more popular than I thought. So curious, just let me know, mostly just curious from you guys. Let me know sometime today during the stream if you like the light theme more, if you like the dark theme more, or if you like a little bit of both, depending on the time of the day. I'm curious what you guys prefer. But already one comment coming in from Bryson here, all caps dark mode. So definitely a resounding dark mode there. But we'll mix it up. Maybe we'll do a little bit of light mode today. Hopefully it's not burning your eyes out. It's the middle of the day here. The sun is shining, so it feels like a light mode kind of day for me today. But anyway, let's go ahead. We'll start breaking into some of these questions, guys. Enough of me just chatting here. I see a ton of excitement about the NHL stream already too. So that is awesome. Very excited to see that. If you guys have questions before we jump in, I know I'm talking a lot here this morning, super excited to be here, but if you have questions, specific questions about your NHL strategy, something you're confused on, something you don't know how to do or anything like that, just pop it into the Office Hours channel in Slack all week. That's totally fine. If you're not in Slack, again, you can get in there for free. So I would just do that. But if you're not in Slack, email us, support@sabersim.com. Let us know, hey, this is a question for the NHL stream this week. I'm confused about, I don't know, how to stack in NHL or something like that. So if you have NHL questions, I see a lot of excitement. If you have NHL questions, get them in. We'll talk about them on stream here. But Bryson said, for the purpose of videos, light is good to see numbers and such, but I use dark. Okay, that's good to know too. Yeah, so if it's easier to see, if you guys have a different opinion on what's better for the stream too, let me know if you prefer one theme for the stream and one theme for your own use or whatever. But anyway, cool. Let's go ahead and get into it. Let's start answering some questions. Enough is enough. I want to start here. So I'm going to start with kind of calling back to I'm going to call back to a conversation we were having yesterday, and the conversation was about eliminating players pre or post build. And is there any difference between doing those things? Is there any risk to doing this one way or the other? The question originally said, does eliminating a player from your pool in step one affect the game simulations itself? So for example, right, we got the NBA slate tonight. If you were to go in here and eliminate Giannis from your pool and then build lineups, do we eliminate all sims where Giannis is optimal? And the answer is no, it doesn't affect the sims in that way. We just simply won't put Giannis into a lineup. So you could still kind of, let's say you were building lineups with sim variance at 10. So you're using single game simulations to determine the projections for each player when we build each lineup. You could still kind of roll that random dice and roll a simulation where Giannis scores 80 fantasy points. We just won't use him. He's been removed from the pool, right? And I explained that in yesterday's show, and I mentioned that ultimately that there's kind of no difference, therefore, between eliminating players pre or post build, other than the fact that if you do it pre-build, you get 100% of your lineups in the post-build process will have the player pool you want. Whereas if you eliminate them post-build, you have the flexibility of being able to add or remove those players back in without having to rebuild lineups, right? But Shady Advice in Slack made a very, very sharp observation that there's a little bit more going on here. And I'm just going to go ahead. I'm going to post his original message here and read it aloud and then talk about kind of the implication of that. Because I just think it's a good follow-up and it's a responsible follow-up for me to say this on stream for anybody that might have watched yesterday. But he said, I wanted to go a bit deeper on your office hours discussion on the impact, again, of locking someone out, eliminating someone pre-build. I think there's a pretty nuanced risk that doing the restrictions in step one can result in dominated lineups, whereas that can't happen if you do it in step three. I decided not to jump in. Okay, that doesn't matter. Let's go ahead and get the actual point here in. And the example that Shady Advice used says it's mostly an issue where sports where the value per player can vary widely and there's a reasonable correlation. Imagine a scenario where player A and B are 100% correlated and costs the same, but player B scores 2x player A. If you lock or restrict player B before you generate lineups, you would get player A in every situation where player B is strictly better. In this example, if you waited until step 3, you'd never get any player A. But if you expand the example a little to lower correlation, you'll only get player A in step 3 when there's the correct game script. So kind of a very theoretical theoretical idea here, but thinking like purely practical, right? Let's go and look at the main slate. I feel like this is best explained looking at football, for example, right? So let's say, for example, right, that we're looking at the slate upcoming this week, and you decide that you are going to fade Patrick Mahomes, right? So what is going to happen there is when we remove him, right, we are going to remove the ability from Patrick Mahomes to be played in lineups, even in combinations of sims that you get when you actually build the lineups that include Patrick Mahomes, right? Because Patrick Mahomes actually has a real correlation value to players like Tyreek Hill, Demarcus Robinson, Travis Kelce, his pass catchers, right? And you have restricted the builder from using Patrick Mahomes in lineups, right? You can artificially reduce the percent chance that guys like Tyreek Hill are showing up in your lineups, right? Because those players are correlated with one another. Even when Tyreek Hill is an optimal player to use in a lineup, right? You may now get less of him. You may get less Tyreek Hill lineups overall because you have removed his primary correlative player from your entire pool. Whereas if you remove Patrick Mahomes in step 3, right, you are just going to remove entire full lineups. It's not so much you have restricted the builder from using certain players in a lineup, or you're forcing certain players to be used in a lineup. Let's actually flip this on its head, because actually now that I'm talking through this, I think it's easier to see as a better example, right? Let's do it this way. Let's say you remove Tyreek Hill from your pool, right? And you've removed him in step 1. And you kind of roll sims, right? You randomly select sims out where the Chiefs defense has a huge day and Patrick Mahomes is the optimal QB. Well, in a lot of those sims, Tyreek Hill is going to be the optimal receiver, right? Since you have now removed him, and obviously these projections are not accurate. I'm looking at this now. This is Tuesday here for next week's main slate. This will tighten up. But since you have removed Tyreek Hill now from your pool, right? It is going to, because the most correlated players remaining in the pool are available, it may artificially inflate the amount of DeMarcus Robinson lineups you have and Josh Gordon lineups and things like that. Just as an example, because those players correlate well with a player who was kind of optimal in that set of game sims. So whereas if you do this in step 3 and limited your exposure or removed Tyreek Hill from your lineups in step 3, you are simply removing entire lineups that have Tyreek Hill, and you are being left with other lineups that were kind of built otherwise optimally. Whereas removing him in step 1 lends some possible chance that you could build lineups that were suboptimal, where the optimal combination of players was Patrick Mahomes and Tyreek Hill in that set of game sims. But since you removed Tyreek Hill, a different player kind of took that correlative slot, even though Tyreek Hill was the strictly better play. I don't think this risk is an extremely high risk. I don't want to scare anybody off of editing their player pool in step 1. I still do it. I kind of understand this risk. Definitely a little bit better now that Shady Advice pointed it out. I don't think this necessarily means that you should just stop removing players from your player pool in step 1 necessarily. I think this is kind of a very nuanced situation. If Kurt's listening, Kurt's going to make fun of me for saying nuance, but that's the exact word that Shady Advice said. And I think that's accurate here, right? This is kind of a nuanced risk, but I think it was worth mentioning here. I think all things being equal, as always, it is probably best to do most of your player pool editing in step 3 for this reason, and also to give yourself flexibility. But if you want to create a defined player pool and make sure that the lineups that you are building only use players from the player pool that you actually want to use, I think it still is fine to do that in step 1. But I wanted to point this out because I talked about this yesterday, and I think this was a really sharp point. So I think I managed to do a decent job of explaining that. There is a thread, a bit of there's a bit of conversation back and forth in the Office Hours channel in Slack if you're interested in reading this a little bit more. If I completely lost you here while I was talking about it, I wouldn't worry, to be completely honest, I wouldn't worry too much about this. I would go read the thread in the Office Hours channel in Slack and see if that helps, and maybe we can take the conversation over there as well. But I think this is an interesting, definitely kind of a deeper dive into the practical implications of this kind of stuff. But anyway, from there, I'm going to move on and answer some more questions here. So, okay, cool. I'm going to real quickly hit this question. I just saw Garland has a couple questions here in YouTube chat, and then we'll jump back to some of the questions that came in before the start of the stream. But Garland said, I've gone back and forth with different optimizers, but my hand-built lineups usually perform better. For someone looking to MME, what are the best settings to use for NBA DFS? Thanks. Yeah, so let's jump over to NBA. So one of the really cool things about SaberSim is that our settings, first of all, our settings are a little bit different than what you might see on a traditional optimizer. But the primary settings that you have control over here are correlation, ownership fade, and sim variance. So correlation, obviously, the higher this is, emphasizing players that have a high positive correlation with one another, avoiding negative correlations. Ownership fade is our approach to deal with ownership, right? The higher it goes, the more we're going to fade high variance, highly owned players. The lower it goes, the less we care about ownership. And sim variance is going to affect the upside and diversity of your lineups by making it so that the higher this slider is, the smaller the buckets of game simulations we're going to use to determine the projections we use for each player when we build every individual lineup, right? So the higher the number is, the higher upside, the more diverse your lineups are, the more varied, and opposite lower. But the coolest part about all of this is that these are actually back tested, and these are data driven here for your particular contest type and the slate. So if you're playing DraftKings tonight, you can go in here and say, if you're playing, so you said you're playing MME. Let's say you're playing the big, what is it? The $15 fadeaway, right? Not my favorite contest, but if you're playing that, we're going to recommend, based on having back tested these sliders, to play your sliders at 0, 4, 10. Maybe instead you're playing high stakes single entry. You're playing a contest with like 200 people, right? One single lineup. If you put a single entry GPP in there and change the entrance to 200, we're going to recommend you approach the contest with these sliders. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of this. In fact, we recommend for most of our users to just roll with the sliders that we give them because they've been back tested against more lineups than you can realistically play in a lifetime. And you add your value in the form of editing projections or ownership or exposure in step 3. So very nice thing about SaberSim here is you're never left with the guesswork of trying to figure out what to do with your settings. You can spend your time and energy actually thinking about what you want to do with your lineups and your strategy. So, and then Bryson followed that up with a quick question. Are college football projections coming soon? Yes, it's on our radar. It is probably the #1 sport that we don't currently have projections for that we want to get them up for. But realistically, I don't think it's likely for this season. I think a realistic goal would be for the opening kickoff of the college football season in 2022 for us to have projections ready to go. So there was a follow-up here question from Michael about those settings. He said, are those settings continuously being backtested and updated over time? Yes, they are. So we will re-backtest pretty much anytime we release a significant change to our model, which affects our projections, our ownership model affecting our ownership projections, correlations are affected by the simulator model as well. Anytime a big update comes out to those things, we'll rerun our backtests and make adjustments. We also typically readjust and rebacktest everything prior to the start of a new season. So everything we have for NBA this season is ready for 2021, so to speak. So. Devin here had a question. Can you show a quick example of how to late swap on NBA for FanDuel? I had some trouble with it yesterday. Yeah, so Devin, I'm actually real quick going to direct you here to this office hours from October 28th. In this, we had a lot of questions about late swap on that particular video here. If you click this video, I'm going to pause it so you guys don't hear me twice. These are all timestamped, and right at the start here, right here, entry editor demo with late swap for both DraftKings and FanDuel. I did a full 17-minute video, or not video, I don't know, segment of this office hours doing a full demo. I'd watch that first. And if we have time before the end of the stream today, I'll jump back. We'll do another one on stream. But I would go watch that first. And that will probably be the most helpful there. So one other thing I'll note too before I move on is that there are tooltips. I know this is DraftKings. I don't have any entries for FanDuel tonight. But for DraftKings, there are tooltips across the whole late swap thing that should kind of show you the process. So like if you're stuck on late swapping, if you click this swap, you'll see another video I recorded where I do a late swap on DraftKings. And it's the same thing on FanDuel. So I don't have entries reserved for FanDuel, but if you were on the FanDuel side of the app and click the same tooltip, there's another video there that will help you out. So. Okay, cool. Real quick, I'm going to jump back and hit some of these questions that came in through Slack before the start of the stream here. This one was from Benny, and this has already been answered in chat as well, but I'll just pull this up. He said, just wanted to know for NBA, as a European, slates usually start at 1 a.m. for me. Wow, that is way past my bedtime. I can't stay up the whole night, of course. Yeah, completely understand, and therefore can't do late swaps always. How should I build my lineups to make sure my disadvantage is not too big? Again, shady advice. I actually think this in this case is very good advice. He said only play turbos and early showdowns. I wouldn't play any late swap contests if you can't do it, unless there are things like the Yahoo guaranteed. The edge is thin enough that you're going to be a losing player long-term if you play contests and don't swap. That summarizes my take pretty much completely. I wouldn't play any NBA DFS slate. This question came in also a couple weeks ago in the NBA channel. I wouldn't play any NBA slate if you can't be sure that you're going to be able to late swap throughout the slate. Right? Starting lineups come out too late. Big news breaks in the middle of the slate far too often, and that information is so impactful to the player projections that I think it would be very difficult to sustain a profit over a long period of time playing NBA DFS with no interest in late swapping. In fact, I think late swapping is the single biggest edge in NBA DFS. So you are giving up a huge edge by not allowing yourself to do that. With all that said, I do think playing either the showdowns or the turbo slates that don't require you to late swap is a great approach. I will pull up here. Oh, I lost my YouTube. I'll pull it back up here. I did a whole video on NBA showdown strategy. So that is up here also in strategy sessions, 3 secrets to beating NBA showdowns. I think our model, again, because we're simulating games and we understand the actual game scripts and context of these games, we are very well equipped for NBA showdown. I think the contests for NBA showdown are a little small. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend for everybody. I think the main slates are going to provide a much bigger edge overall than showdown. But if main slates aren't an option for you because you're not going to be able to late swap on any slates or a specific slate, go play the showdowns, because I think there's still an edge there. And your edge that you get from playing showdowns optimally is probably bigger than the edge you would have playing main slates suboptimally. So that's what I would recommend there. Braden said, should we have ownership fade at 0 for main slate contests? I think it depends on your contest you're playing. I would say like on a 5-game slate like tonight, this is a rather smaller NBA slate. I don't think it's going to make sense to have a ownership fade at 0 for most of these, right? By default, it's going to be actually pretty high. On 5-game slates, there's definitely makes some sense to intentionally fade ownership a little bit more. Some of the smaller single entries, maybe. But I would trust the defaults for most of this. So, Robert, I see your question as well here. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So Robert said, I watched the video about adjusting NBA projections. The one example was checking Dwight Howard's offensive rebound and comparing that to the opposing team's offensive rebound percentage. Then bumping Dwight 1 to 2 points if the numbers call for it. My question is, how do I know I'm not adding points for something that has already been accounted for by the simulations? Yeah, so Robert, it sounds like what you probably watched were one of these older videos. We've got a couple older shortcuts to better NBA projections, adjusting exposures, things like that. I think the information in those videos is still valuable, but the model itself has come a long, long way, even in just a year. And I think the necessity to edit player projections in step one is really kind of dwindling quickly. I don't do that at all. It is not a part of my process. I am more, if I'm going to touch anything in step one, I would be more interested in tweaking ownership. I think I personally have a better skill at predicting DFS ownership than I am at projecting NBA players. So I kind of trust the projections overall. I think my answer to this ultimate question here of how do I know if I'm adjusting something that's already being accounted for in the simulations, I would try to focus on situations where you are dealing with an unpredictable situation, looking at an opportunity to add some value there, right? It's not, this question comes in often of like, can you just let me know everything that's included in the model? And I will go then add in everything that isn't on your list. And the issue is that we essentially attempt to include all relevant information into our NBA model or any of our models, right? If we could immediately just point to defensive, offensive rebound percent, right? And say, nope, we don't take that into account. We just would take it into account, right? As soon as you can identify the thing that the model doesn't take into account, it's immediately something that goes on our list to take into account. What is difficult to properly account for in any model where you are trying to project something is situations that lack a lot of historical data or context or anything valuable to help come up with that projection, right? A situation where a star player or multiple star players have been out. Last night is a good example, right? Embiid's out, Tobias Harris is out, which is a situation that has come up before, but Drummond is new to the Sixers. They have other new players, right? That situation, especially for early in the season, is difficult to project, right? Immediately, Korkmaz is going to bump up. He's going to be a great play. Shake Milton's going to be a great play. George Niang is going to be a good play. Andre Drummond is obviously a fantastic play. Danny Green's a great play, but like ultimately what that rotation is precisely going to look like, who's going to get the minutes, who's going to get the usage is hard to project. That's a good situation to dive into and add additional value. Less from the standpoint of looking for a very specific statistic and saying, oh, SaberSim doesn't take this into account. I'm going to go in and look at the offensive rebounding percentage for every team and make adjustments from there. I would spend more time looking for situations that are unpredictable, that are inherently kind of random and chaotic to try to add your value. So like tonight, right? A good example of tonight, I think probably the big pivot place on the entire slate right now is Cade Cunningham. I don't know if he's going to be on a minutes limit again. He's almost min price, clearly going to have a bunch of fantasy points per minute if he's on the floor, right? If you can do your own research here, and I don't know what that research might potentially look like. Maybe you're digging into a coach's quote or a reason to believe that he might be more or less limited. I don't know. Right. But it's an unpredictable situation of how Cade Cunningham is going to play with the Pistons, how he affects other players playing on the Pistons, how many minutes he's going to get, that kind of thing. I think that's more useful. And I know it sounds like you got this idea of making these adjustments to a player's offensive rebounding percentage from one of our videos. So I apologize if I'm giving you a little bit of conflicting information here. Again, that's twofold. One is that I personally am not the right person to ask that because my approach to these things is not making a lot of adjustments to projections. I like to add a lot of my value, adjusting my exposures, finding leverage on the field in the post-build process rather than adjusting projections pre-build. But the second reason is that the model has come a long way, and where we would have even just last year really recommended people spend some time to dial in the projections, we have really invested hard in making this model as good as it can be. And I think our messaging has changed a little bit from what we recommend people to do to be successful, even just in a year. So Robert said, no worries. It means the simulations have improved since I watched the video. Good news. Appreciate the response. Yeah. So yeah, I'm glad that was helpful. I will say the last note on this before I move on is we are planning on doing a video here probably this month, I would say, similar to my video where I just put out with my NFL process and my MLB process that I put out earlier this summer. But we're actually going to have Max come on instead and talk through his NBA DFS process. And I think Max does still have a little bit more of a bigger focus on adjusting projections than I do. So if you're interested in how somebody whose process really revolves around that particular part of the process looks like, I would check that video out. And that's probably something we're shooting for in November here. So cool. Going to jump back here quickly to the office hours chat. And this is from Flower Farmer, who said he's a new user. So welcome, Flower Farmer. He said, when reviewing your lineups for NBA GPP, which percentile should I be sorting by, 85th or average? Yeah, so let's talk about this. Let's do a test build real quick. Quickly adjust some projections here just so we don't get that DraftKings message. And we'll just build 20 lineups, see what they look like. And I assume, Flower Farmer, that when you say you're reviewing your lineups, you're literally just talking about like, hey, you're getting ready for an upcoming slate and picking what lineups to use. If you're watching this live and you're actually talking about literally reviewing past slates, let me know. We can cover that too. Maybe we just will. But I'm assuming you're talking about like trying to actually dial in for a given slate. The percentile's up here, and you can change it. And what happens when you change it up here is it's going to change every player's projection, their average projection here, or their mean projection, to this 85th percentile, right? And then kind of resort the lineups, looking at now what are the best lineups overall when every player in the lineup hits their 85th percentile projection, right? And I think this can be kind of useful. I think one of the most interesting things, it actually really dramatically changed the lineups here in this particular case. Like Cade Cunningham is just gone. Down into one lineup. Oh, it's because I have a custom projection for him. Wait a minute. Hang on. Who's the other guy I did that for? That had an interesting impact. So I guess if you update custom projections, they don't update for the percentile. But anyway, what it does is it resorts your lineups overall to give you the highest scoring lineups when every player hits that particular percentile outcome. So in this case, it's what are the best lineups when every player in the lineup hits the outcome they meet or exceed 15% of the time or less. I like to keep this on average. And the reason why I don't think you need to use this in particular is because of the sim variance slider, right? On a traditional optimizer, for example, all of your lineups are going to be optimized purely by looking at average projection. Even if you go in and put in a bunch of rules and player groups and restrictions, at the end of the day, what the optimizer is going to do is it is going to give you the best average projected lineups possible. With SaberSim, we have a different approach. And what we are actually doing here is with sim variance at very high, at 9, we're going to take a very small bucket of our game simulations. We have thousands of game simulations of every game on the slate. We're going to take a really small bucket of those, and we're going to use the projections that those players scored in that set of game simulations and build the best lineup we can around it. And then for the next lineup, we're going to use a different set of game simulations and build the best possible lineup around it. And the reason why this works, the reason why this is good, is because it takes into account the player's real range of outcomes, and players that have high upside naturally show up in your lineups more often at the rate that it makes sense for them to do that by default. That is how all 500 of the lineups in your pool are made, right? So percentiles here really is just kind of a sorting method that sorts the lineups, basically looking at what the highest scoring lineup is when a certain outcome occurs. But this outcome isn't very common, nor is it very necessary, right? Ultimately, what ends up happening when you bank a contest isn't that you have every player in the lineup have an 85th percentile outcome. It's more like you have maybe some player hit their 50th percentile outcome, but one player hits their 99th percentile outcome, and one guy has their 70th percentile outcome, and one guy has their 92nd percentile outcome, right? You have this wide variety of scores. So all this to say, I know this is kind of a wordy answer. You don't need to change this, right, at all, Sim variance is making sure that your lineups have high upside to begin with. I leave it at average. I don't think you need to change it. If there is a particular reason that you can come up with and you are interested in changing this, it is also not going to hurt your lineups at all. I like to use it primarily for research. I find it interesting, actually, in particular on NFL slates, to switch things over to maybe the 85th percentile and look at what lineups might score when that outcome is hit. And I sometimes like to look at it and intuitively ask myself, like, I don't even know, especially with like cheaper, more value plays. Can Dan Arnold actually score 20 points, right? For this lineup to have its total 85th percentile outcome, Dan Arnold needs to score 20. Is that like, does that intuitively resonate with me? And if it doesn't, maybe that changes my approach to how I want to handle that particular player on the slate. But long story short, you do not need to change this. And I think it's totally just fine to leave it on average. So, cool. Dino, is it? Last time you asked me a question, I wasn't sure if it was Dino or Dino. I think it's Dino, but let me know. When maxing out 150 NBA lineups, seems like I'm only cashing 15 lineups. I only maxed out a few times, but it seems like those numbers are too low. Should I be restricting the amount of the player pool? Yeah, there's a few notes on this. So first of all, I would try to remove the idea of caching being your goal for your lineups. What I think is a better approach is to look at your top 1% outcomes. And what I mean by that is an average player is going to put 1% of their lineups in the top 1% of the contest taken over a long period of time. It is, okay, Dino. Yeah, cool. So taken over a long period of time, right? So if you're totally average and you build 100 lineups, on average, one of those lineups is going to be in the top 1% of the contest, right? Now, that's not practically what actually happens on any given slate, right? Because your lineups are somewhat correlated to one another, right? Like if Cade Cunningham busts tonight, it's unlikely, like maybe just doesn't even play, right? Just scores 0. It's unlikely that you actually have a very even spread of one lineup showing up in every single individual percentile in the contest. You're going to have a bunch of lineups at the bottom, but over a long period of time, an average player is going to have 1% of their lineups in the top 1% of the contest. If you are outpacing that expectation, if you are putting 1.5% of your lineups in the top 1%, or even 2% of your lineups in the top 1%, you are a better than average player. And I think this metric is a much better approach to take than to just see how often your lineups are cashing. If you want to min cash, if you are trying to min cash your lineups, I would say a few things. I would say, one, that might be a sign to scale back some of your bankroll, right? If you feel like you need to win back some of your entry fees on any given night, it might be a good sign to just scale back a little bit. 2, there are contest types that are a better fit, like cash games themselves, but also more flatter payout structure contests like single entry GPPs that will give you a better % chance of just cashing on some of your lineups. But I wouldn't make that your goal of your lineups, and I wouldn't use it as a metric to see how you're doing. I would track how you are doing, what percentage of your lineups are pacing in the top 1% of the contests that you are playing. That's even going to be a better metric than something like ROI or profit, which are very fickle calculations and very subject to huge swings based on when you bank, right? Top 1% equity in your contest is a way better approach to seeing how you're doing. And you can do that. You can look at, there are tools like Roto Tracker that will do that for you, that will track what your finishing percentage is in contests over a long period of time. You can also check it manually. You can literally go and look and see. I was doing this manually for a long time before I ever found Roto Tracker, which I now use, right? But you can go in and see and actually track in like a Google sheet and see, okay, on yesterday's slate, I played 150 lineups and how many ended up in the top 1% of your contest, right? Not how many banked, not how many cash, but how many were in the top 1%, right? Your expectation for that slate would be 1.5. If you had 2 out of 150 in the top 1%, you actually outpaced your expectation. And again, all of this should be measured ultimately on the long term. In NBA in particular, because you don't have big stacks and your exposures are typically, if you're playing optimally, going to be a little bit more condensed than a sport like baseball or NFL. What's actually going to end up happening is you're probably going to have a lot of slates in a row where you have 0 lineups in the top 1%, and your good slates, your big slates are going to be, you're going to have a ton of lineups in the top 1%, like maybe 20 out of 150 or something like that, because you nail your core. That's actually like, so that's what happened to me last night. I have not had a single slate this season so far where I had any lineup finish in the top 1%, I think. Last night, I had almost of a set of like 50 lineups, I had like 30 lineups finish in the top 1%, right? And crypto actually noticed here too, no question, but SaberSim killed it last night with NBA, hit a 2x ROI and took top 20 in a single entry. Yeah, it was a really good slate, partly because there were really good plays that at the low stakes, people just didn't get on. I know like Drummond was like 90% in high stakes, 60% in low stakes, right? That's like 30% ownership edge on the best play on the slate. Yeah, but I know it was a good night for a lot of SaberSim users. But bouncing back to this question, those are the metrics that I would use to track instead. Top 1% equity, and you can track it manually yourself. You can check out a tool like Roto Tracker, but that is going to be a much more sustainable approach to determining if you're playing right? Because that's actually really what's at the heart of this question. Is like, and I've been there too. Of like, should I be restricting the player pool? Like, am I doing well? Is this bad variance? Am I running bad? Like, what's actually going on here? And that can provide a lot of security of knowing like, okay, I'm playing well, I'm just running bad, and I shouldn't make any changes to my process. So, but anyway, hopefully that was helpful. Let me know if you have any other questions on that. And it's definitely a good question. So, okay, cool. So we are, let's see, about 42 minutes in so far. I don't have any other questions in my queue at the moment. But I do have the one question that I got in through my YouTube comments here. So let me go ahead. Actually, just going to go ahead and grab this because I think this is a really good question. And I want to talk about this, and I want to bring this up. So give me a second here. Let me go ahead and track this thing down here. I should have had this ready. Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah. So this is from Kevin. And this was a comment on my office hour stream from October 7th. And he said, you have made it easy to understand how single game lineups are built. The optimal lineup is the output of each sim. I can't connect the dots to making lineups with multiple games. Where does the builder start making a lineup, and how are subsequent players added? Yeah, so I love this question because I think in general, a lot of times we start when we're kind of trying to explain how SaberSim works. A lot of times we actually start with the example of the single game because I think it resonates with you pretty easily. You can kind of understand what game scripts look like for a single football game, how simulating the games allow you to kind of write those game scripts out, and then how you can optimize a lineup built for an individual game simulation. But then when you make the jump to a bigger NFL slate, for example, you have 11 games, and not only are there more games in question now, but potentially as the sim variance slider itself comes down, right, we are actually incorporating a bigger bucket of game simulations even into our projections, right? So like, what does that all look like? How do these things start to fit together? So what ultimately happens when we create a lineup, and let's assume that we're looking at the individual in let's assume that we're looking at a main slate for NFL, and the sim variance slider is not 10, right? So it includes a portion of game simulations, a small bucket of game simulations for every game on the slate when we build each lineup. So that is really the thing that happens first when you start building a single lineup for a multi-slate game, is that we will bucket the sims, right? And we will figure out what each player scored on average in that set of game sims. So for example, at high, I don't know the exact numbers of how many game simulations are included in these, but if it's 1 at 10, let's assume that maybe it's 20 game simulations at 7. I don't know if that's right, but it's approximately maybe kind of close, right? So we'll determine the player projections first there that they scored in that particular set of game sims, right? At that point, there is going to be a player that is added to the lineup, right? It might be the highest overall score on that particular set of game projections. It might be the highest score on the slate. Maybe it's a QB, maybe it's a receiver, right? There's going to be some kind of initial player that goes in, right? And the reason why that kind of has to happen first is because without any players in the lineup, we can't really start thinking about correlation or anything like that, right? Oh, actually, I should say this first. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. The other thing that comes in is every player then for that particular lineup has a multiplier based on where the ownership fade slider is set. So every player's projection gets changed, gets altered based on where your ownership fade slider is set, based on that player's ownership, and based on the variance of that player's range of outcomes. So a player that is much higher owned that scores the exact same projection in that set of game sims may end up with a little bit of a lower number that determines if they go on into the lineup than a player that was much lower owned that scored the same amount of points, right? So the ownership fade slider kind of acts as a multiplier, acts as a changing factor to the player projections for a particular set of game sims. From there, a player will be entered into the lineup, a player that grades out well from how many points they scored relative to their ownership and relative to their salary and all those other factors, and a player is entered into the lineup, right? At that point, we can start thinking of correlative factors of other players as the lineup gets built. So now the second player that goes into the lineup, we can consider that player's correlation, right, to the other players in the lineup. If the very first player to go into the lineup was Patrick Mahomes, then there's a better reason for Tyreek Hill now to be the second player to go into the lineup because of the correlative factor. So that's kind of how the lineup starts getting put together. Right? It literally gets built player by player. There's a lot more going on there. Obviously, there's exposure settings that you can set before the build. There's minimum uniques. There's stacking rules. There's min salary requirements. There's all kinds of different stuff, right? But that's like a kind of simplified version of actually how the lineup itself ends up being constructed. And also the difference from thinking about a single game simulation NFL showdown lineup, for example, where sim variance is at 10, to a NFL main slate with 11 games where sim variance is at 7 or 8, and we're incorporating multiple game simulations in. So the game simulations are still powering everything, right? But on a bigger slate, we have more players to choose from, right? There's more players that can be entered into the lineup. And also, if sim variance comes down, there are more game simulations that are in the bucket determining the player projections, right? But it is still the game simulations themselves that are pretty much powering everything. So I assume Mr. Kevin is not watching the stream today, unless by sheer luck you are, Kevin. So if you ask this question and you are watching here live, give me a shout out in the chat, because that would be a wonderful coincidence here. But I will do my best to get this particular timestamp recording of this particular section of the video over to you to answer your question. And if you have more follow-up for me, feel free just to reply in the YouTube comments or just send us an email at support@sabersim.com. But thank you for asking this question. Really good question. And anybody else that's watching, if I lost you there, let me know, because I think this is the key jump, right? This is a very important jump with SaberSim. The first jump is understanding, I think, for a single game, what we are really saying when we say that we are simulating these games out, but then also using those simulations directly to determine the projections for each player when we build each lineup, right? That solves a lot of difficult DFS problems and simplifies the process enormously for a DFS player, and is kind of an important first step in getting kind of the value of SaberSim. The next step is taking that, once you have an understanding there of and applying how that works for slates with multiple games, and for slates where you are not just using single game simulations for every lineup, you're actually bucketing the simulations at that point, right? And also, of course, with multiple games, we start to have a bigger impact of things like correlation and things like that. So a layer of complexity gets added on when we have more games and bigger buckets of game simulations, right? But I think it's an important bridge to jump, or a bridge to gap there, right? That really starts tying up all the loose ends. So if I lost anybody there as well, let me know, because I think that's just a really important point to grasp. But don't hear anything right now, so must have done a decent job answering that question. All quiet here on my end. With all that said, that's the last question I had to answer today. 49 minutes, about 10 minutes early here. Actually, I started about a minute late here today. So it looks like we're actually about 9 minutes until the end of the hour. I don't have any other questions in my queue here today. So I think we will go ahead and leave it there. Again, I will say a few final notes that I will leave you all with here is let's go ahead and pull the YouTube back up again. One more time, I will say, check out this video. Recorded it on Sunday morning, walking through my full NFL DFS process, especially if you've been following along with some of our NFL content. I think it can be interesting to see how I put all the pieces together. Definitely not really probably any surprises to anybody in this video, to be completely honest. My process looks pretty similar to what I tell people to do here on stream every day and what a lot of our other NFL videos kind of look like and preach. Look forward to the NBA contest selection video coming out tomorrow. If you have been wondering what the best NBA contests to play are on DraftKings or FanDuel, I go through the lobby and pinpoint the exact contests in order that I would start to add them to your contest mix, including when to potentially mix in cash games, when to start playing contests from the other site if you're only playing on FanDuel, if you're only playing on DraftKings. Should be a pretty good video. Looking forward to getting that out. And then Thursday, going live with a couple members from the SaberSim community, a couple of our NHL DFS experts to talk NHL strategy, answer your guys' questions, talk through some of this stuff. Really excited about that. So look forward to that on Thursday. That will be live at 2 p.m. Eastern. In the meantime, again, I will be live here tomorrow for just normal office hours, open Q&A, same time, same place. In the meantime, enjoy this little 5-game NBA slate tonight. Should be a good one. Some solid value opportunities already opening up. And I will talk to you guys all tomorrow. See ya.